Thank you all for coming. I know it's the end of semester, so actually having almost full house is pretty damn cool. I love that. Thank you very much. So today I'm actually going to talk about wildlife conservation society and our increasingly important relationship with Indigenous peoples. And many folks, when you ask them, what do international conservation organizations do? And the first thing they don't think about is respectful engagement with Indigenous peoples. Most people think that international conservation organizations focus on fortress conservation, which is protecting an area and keeping people out and not letting anybody in there. Okay, so to understand how WCS got to the position we are today, where we're really engaging with Indigenous folks, I need to actually walk you through how we were established, when we were established, and what our mission is, okay? So we are the oldest international conservation NGO. In fact, we're the oldest conservation NGO. We were established in 1895. Most organizations like World Wildlife Fund, 1960s, Audubon Society, 1930, nobody else other than us got started in 1895. To be completely clear, the Zoological Society of London was established by the King in 1826, but it was purely as a zoo to entertain and amaze the populace, which is what royalty would want to do. So we're a really old organization. How did we get established? Teddy Roosevelt helped establish us. Teddy Roosevelt was an avid hunter. In 1883, Roosevelt went out to the Dakotas. It wasn't a state then. It was a territory. And he went out because he's a big game hunter and he wanted to hunt bison. He was out there for 3 weeks and he didn't find a goddamn bison, not a one. 4 weeks, he found one bison, he shot it, taxidermied its head, and it's now in the summer White House, which was Roosevelt's summer home when he was president on Long Island. And it's still there if you want to go and look at it. It was one of the last bison to be shot in the Dakotas. When he was out there for 3 weeks looking for bison, he saw a massive destruction of wildlife by commercial hunters. I mean, unbelievable numbers of animals were being shot and shipped to East Coast markets. He was appalled. He was absolutely appalled. But it was bison destruction that really, really got him going. How many bison were in the US, say in the 1700s? Does anyone know? 35 million bison. 35 million. This was a huge population. By 1830s to 1860s, commercial hunting began. After the Civil War in 1865, there was a purposeful strategy to kill bison, not for food, not for their hides. What were they killed for? They were killed to deprive native tribes from a food source and a cultural identity. It was a purposeful strategy by the US government to annihilate the tribes, the plains tribes. And it was wildly successful. In 1860, there was about 10 million bison left. In 1889, how many bison were there in the lower 48 states? 300. 300 animals. We went from 30 million to 300 in about 50 years. Absolutely startling. No wonder Teddy Roosevelt was crazy about conservation, because he saw North American wildlife about to go extinct. So in the late 1890s, he lobbied the state government of New York to establish the New York Zoological Society for 3 purposes. One, to create a zoo, but not a caged area. He called it a zoological park, because what he wanted, he totally believed that within 20 years, most of the big game, the big critters in North America would disappear. They would go extinct. And he wanted a zoological park for future generations to be able to have their children see North American wildlife, not in a jail, the KG thing, but in a park-like environment that looked like the habitat that they went to, that they came from. That was stunningly imaginative back in the 1890s. So he established the New York Zoological Society to establish a park, which is now called the Bronx Zoo. He wanted more information about zoological science so we could understand not only how could we conserve the wildlife that were still there, but how to restore them. And he was really keen on establishing protected areas and end commercial hunting to stop the wanton destruction of wildlife. So protected areas. New York Zoological Society helped establish the first protected area, one of the first protected areas in 1929. That was in South Africa, Kruger National Park, 5 million acres. Since 1929, New York Zoological Society, which 100 years later was renamed the Wildlife Conservation Society, has helped establish 347 protected areas. Now, again, you might think those are all state-run national parks where we exclude people. That would be wrong. Over half of these are indigenous reserves, or in the marine areas, those are called locally managed marine areas. These are basically protected areas that protect indigenous peoples' resources protected by indigenous peoples. Restoration was a big reason for establishing the New York Zoological Society. So it was established in 1895. By 1907, the first attempt to restore purebred bison to the West was shipping 15 animals from the Bronx Zoo, from the New York Zoological Park, out to Oklahoma, to a reserve that was established by Teddy Roosevelt. Unfortunately, Teddy Roosevelt pushed out all the Comanche, where it was their territory. And the remarkable thing is when these 15 animals turned up at a railhead in Oklahoma to go to the reservation where they were going to be released, Quanah Parka, the Comanche chief at the time, he turned up at the railroad station, and he led the trailers, the wagon trains, along 15 miles along the road from the railhead to be released into what was his territory. And there were thousands and thousands of people there cheering, watching these big shaggy beasts being returned to a place where they'd been eradicated in order to actually starve the Comanches to death. Kind of weird. WCS continues to actually do these restoration efforts. In 2015, we worked with Lauren Birdrattler of the Blackfeet Nation to reach out to the Elk Island National Park in Alberta to say, you guys have got too many bison. Could we have your surplus bison? And in 2016, 87 calves were moved from Alberta across the border and released to restore the bison herd of the Blackfeet in Montana. And in 2022, the Kainai, which are part of the Blackfeet Confederacy, but Blackfeet Confederacy in Alberta, they received 22 bison from the Bronx Zoo to restore their herds. And the Blackfeet in Montana and the Kainai in Alberta agreed to make sure that there were no barriers between Blackfeet territory in Montana and Kainai territory in Alberta, so the bison could move across the prairie as they've always done. Really cool. Research was this second big thing that was really important to Teddy Roosevelt and really important in the establishment of the New York Zoological Society. WCS established the first international research station. The Department of Tropical Research, William Beebe, who was a bird guy, a jungle guy, a marine guy. He was like a classic multi-person naturalist, astoundingly clever guy, and amazingly productive in lots of different domains. He established the research station in what was then British Guiana. It then moved to Bermuda, where Gloria Hollister, when you think about the 1916 and 1920s, who do you think were the researchers? Men or women? Mostly men. Beebe was just amazing. 80% of the researchers in the Department of Tropical Research were women. What? Why did he pick women? Because they were much more meticulous, they were much more engaged, they were much more determined to answer the questions than the guys from Harvard who were kind of interested in science, but not really. So 80% of the Department of Tropical Research were women, and Gloria Hollister was an astoundingly successful researcher. She was actually, when they took the bathyscaphe, that was the first attempt to take a human object deep into the ocean. She took the bathyscaphe into Bermuda down to a startling depth of 3,384 feet. The first person to get anywhere close to a really, really deep adventure in the ocean. And that was her that did it. Amazing. WCS has produced, hired and supported lots and lots of scientists. George Schaller, remarkable guy. In the 1950s, he went to what is now Rwanda or DR Congo, which was then the Belgian Congo, to study mountain gorillas, the first ever study of mountain gorillas. Then he went to Serengeti and did the first ever study of lions. Then he went to China and did the first ever study of pandas. Then George is 85 and he's still doing the first ever studies. He's quite extraordinary. An amazing, productive, and brilliant naturalist. Nyawira Muthiga, she's a young Kenyan who WCS hired as a research assistant back in the 70s. She's now running the marine program in Kenya and Madagascar, again, doing fantastic research. And Gallo Zapata, I hired Gallo as oh my gosh, he was a high school student in Ecuador to try and help us do some work. He eventually got his Ph.D. He's now running all of the science, all of the research for the WCS Ecuador program. Really, really important, all of this work. And astoundingly productive. WCS has produced vast amounts of stuff. Between 2000 and 2024, how many peer-reviewed journal articles did we produce? Any guesses? 5,135. An amazing amount of stuff and good stuff. So what did we learn from all of this good stuff? Well, Teddy Roosevelt would be whirling in his grave because he established the New York Zoological Society because he was terrified that unsustainable use was going to force many species into extinction. And the sad thing is that in many places is still true. Sally Lamb, a WCS researcher in Gabon, looked at unhunted areas and hunted areas. And in hunted areas, the biomass of wildlife was 76% less than in unhunted areas. And 2 species, gorillas and yellowback duikers, went locally extinct. She couldn't find any in the hunted areas. So hunting still has can have an amazingly adverse impact on wildlife. And this was hunting just for food. This was not hunting for trade. And the reason big critters disappear, we found, is because humans, like all wildlife, and we're wildlife, are optimal foragers. And optimal foragers hunt things that have a high return to investment. So big critters, big body critters, and this is from Peru, so like brocket deer, collared peccaries, spider monkeys, howler monkeys, they're relatively large-bodied, and so for a hunter, they provide greater returns to investment than, say, a ground squirrel. And this is a super example of of a study following Mashkapiro Native American Indians on their hunts. Optimal foraging theory is all about preferencing big critters over small critters, and the abundance of the big critters is irrelevant. So this agouti, hunters encountered agoutis 53 times, but only chased them and tried to hunt them 7. They encountered ground squirrels 58 times, but never bothered to hunt them because they weren't in their diet break. They weren't in their foraging mix because it wasn't profitable enough to do it. But if you look, 10 out of 11 encounters with brocket deer, the hunters went after it. 23 out of 23 collared peccary, every time they saw a collared peccary, they went after it. So one thing we've learned is that big critters are much more susceptible to being hunted to local extinction than little critters. When you lose the big critters, any ideas what this is? That is an elephant shit in Gabon. But what else is it? It's not just elephant shit. What else is it? Yeah. It's like a little nursery. There are 13 different species of trees and lianes in this one dung pile. When you take out the big critters, which are seed dispersers, all you have left is the little critters, and they're mostly rodents, and those are seed predators. So if you take out the big critters, you lose these fantastic fertilized patches. You lose those things. So unsustainable hunting is bad for humans, particularly indigenous peoples, because they have no longer anything to eat. And it's really bad for the environment because you've disturbed the ecology of the system. The other big thing our scientists have found is big wild places matter. Most of our researchers go to big wild places because they're the few places left on Earth that have relatively complete assemblages of native plants and animals. Everywhere else is beat up. And if you want to understand about ecology, you don't go and work on a Mercedes-Benz that's been hit by a tractor trailer, because that doesn't tell you what a Mercedes-Benz should look like. You want to actually work with a Mercedes-Benz that come out of the showroom. It's got all its bits working. So you go to intact places because that's where you learn about ecology. If you go to a place that's beat up, all you learn out is a beat up ecology, which is not very useful. But intact places are only about 10% of the planet. That's a challenge. And we're really concerned about that because they hold about 80 to 90% of the biodiversity of the planet at the moment. But they're shrinking because humans are turning them into other things. And these intact places are really important because we believe there's going to be a humans are driving wildlife through a bottleneck. We're doing that by converting wildlife habitat into other things like agriculture. We need to eat too, but we're converting things into farms, into oil palm plantations, into timber plantations. And that's going to push critters through a bottleneck. Climate change is also putting wildlife through a bottleneck. And the great thing about these big intact places is we believe they're going to make the bottleneck as wide as possible and as short as possible. And if you make a wide, short bottleneck, hopefully you'll get more species survive to the big question mark, which is, are humans actually going to change our behavior? Are we actually going to have policies and practices that are nature friendly? So until we become nature friendly, we want to make that bottleneck not long and narrow. We want to make it wide and short. And intact places are one way to do that. And then the last and the most significant thing that our scientists have learned is that every intact place that we've ever worked in is home to somebody. Is home to indigenous peoples and local communities who've been there for millennia. It's their home. They are natural resource dependent. They need the native plants and animals for their corporeal benefits and for their cultural identity. I was sitting in a longhouse in the Manatee River in Bolivia, and we're through a translator, me speaking Spanish and the translator speaking Chimani. I was talking to this lovely guy, and he said in translation, David, you know, if the forest disappears, I'll still be a man. I won't be a Chimani. And to me, that understanding, and our scientists have clearly understood this, that a deep relationship between indigenous peoples and nature is something that's very close to WCS, very close to WCS's mission as well. We want to save wildlife and wild places. And so do the Chimani, so do the Kanak, so do the Tawaka, so do the Efe, so do many, many indigenous peoples around the planet. So WCS began to understand how important relationships with indigenous people were. This is just some research that we did to look at the importance of indigenous people in terms of the territories they occupy, the biodiversity that they support, and the numbers are startling. And if we want to prevent the 6th great species extinction caused by human neglect and abuse, we need to really, really work closely with indigenous peoples. So WCS, for the last 30 years, has really been figuring out how to respectfully engage with indigenous peoples. And trust and shared interests are the key. That's Gilda, my wife. That's a lot younger me in the middle. In the northeastern Congo, what was then called Zaire, working with Efe and Mbuti hunter-gatherers. And it took us 6 months before anyone in any clan was willing to work with us. Any clan was willing to allow us to follow them on their work with them. So trust is all WCS staff who work in the field spend months and months and months on the ground. And they've learned that spending a long time with people is an essential component of trust building. And it's completely different to many conservation NGOs that I call conservation tourists. They have an office in the capital city. They get into their Land Cruisers and boom, off they go, boom, boom. And they end up in the village and they go, we're here from this NGO and we've come to help save you. And they spend 4 hours there and then they go, boom, right back to the capital city again. Conservation tourism is never going to build the trust and relationship building that's so important to respectfully engaging indigenous peoples and local communities. Marcio Ares, in the late 1990s, he was a primatologist working on red-faced uacaris. They're totally cool. Center of the Amazon, off the Amazon River, close to a place called Tefe. The community he was working with, who were also interested in preserving their forest and their lakes and rivers, told him that commercial hunters from Tefe were coming in and stealing their fish. That's an arapaima. It's an air-breathing fish that grows to 2 or 3 meters. And so commercial fishers were coming up from this town, going into their lands, stealing their fish. Marcio and the community leaders went to the provincial government, and they established the first sustainable community reserve in Brazil. There's now 40 sustainable community reserves in Brazil, and that gave the community the rights to, when they found illegal fishers or fishers coming into their lands without permission, they could call the municipal police to come and arrest them. A huge change. Now arapaima is the major resource that feeds the community, sends their kids to school, provides them healthcare. It's pretty awesome. Dale Lewis was a rhino researcher of WCS in Zambia. He found out when he was talking to the communities that the protected areas, the green areas, were great. They brought tourists, but not a single dollar or not a single kwacha went to the communities. It went to the state. What came out of the protected areas was wildlife that ate their livestock and trampled their fields. So Dale said with the community, couldn't we figure out a way where you could benefit for wildlife and get compensated for the human-wildlife conflict? So he convinced the government to establish game management areas managed by the communities and doing trophy hunting, where rather than $4 for an antelope in a local meat market, they got $4,000 from the hunters. So again, working with communities to meet their needs. Andy Tabor and Mike Painter worked with the Isoseños in the Chaco in Bolivia. And they were about to be tossed off their lands by a Brazilian gas pipeline company. And Andy and Mike worked with the Isoseños to convince the government to establish the Caia National Park to be co-managed between CERNAP, the National Park Service, and the Isoseños, to create an Isoseño territory, and most importantly, to get a perpetual rent from the Brazilian oil gas pipeline company to compensate the Isoseños for a gas pipeline across their territory, a perpetual rent. And that rent is still being paid now 30 years later. In the Maya Biosphere Reserve, WCS worked with indigenous Maya to increase the value of the resources that they had. They were selling ocellated turkeys in the local market for $1 a turkey. WCS engaged a group of wonderfully wacky turkey hunters in the United States. There's 5 different subspecies of turkeys, wild turkeys. The ocellated turkey is the only one that's outside of the US, and many trophy hunters want to get all 5. They're willing to spend $2,500 for a bird. And that $2,500 was a lot more money than $1 in a local market. Lily Painter's a Bolivian researcher who fell in love with an area called Madidi in the lowlands. She's been working with the Takana for 25 years, helping the Takana to establish their rights to create an indigenous territory and to benefit from those rights. And one of the things that she helped do, they sustainably harvest caiman. But rather than selling caiman at a low value, the skins go to Italy, to Gucci, for really snazzy shoes and handbags. And the meat goes to a Michelin star restaurant in La Paz, where it's sold at, I don't know, $20 a plate. So again, thinking about how to help communities benefit from their resources in a way that benefits nature too. We work in a lot of marine areas. In Fiji, it's really weird. Native Fijians, I would call indigenous because they meet all of the categories of indigeneity according to the United Nations rights for indigenous people, except they've never been oppressed, which is really weird. They've never been oppressed. So actually, according to the UN, they're not indigenous. They're native, which is kind of it. So we've worked with native Fijians and a lot of women to establish locally managed marine areas, which are areas that they now have exclusive control over and the authority to manage themselves. Most recently, many conservation NGOs focus a lot on partnership with indigenous peoples, but not indigenous-led conservation. So an NGO would come to a community and say, we've got a cool idea and we've got some money from MacArthur Foundation or some other foundation. Do you want to work with us? And I'm cool with that. But WCS is really seeing the value of working with communities to say, what do you want? What are your visions of the future and how do you want to get there? And what can we do to support your efforts rather than how can you support our interests? And the community in Tamshuacatawayo in Peru, they decided that they decided alone they were not going to hunt for either domestic consumption, for hunting for their family, or for sale, any species that was low in abundance and reproduced really slowly. They were only going to hunt things that were abundant and reproduced rapidly, like brocket deer, peccary, collared peccaries, white-lipped peccaries, and agoutis. Today, they're selling those to 2 restaurants in Iquitos, the big market town, which is about a long day's boat ride from Tamshoakutuwayo. And when one of the chefs said, "Oh, this is great. My customers really, really love this, being able to eat traditional foods. Can you give us more?" They said, "No, we've got a quota. We're not going to exceed our quota." So indigenous-led conservation, I think, is the future, and we really need to think about advocating for it and supporting it. And we absolutely need to focus. If you're going, think about Teddy Roosevelt. Bison were hunted at such enormous numbers that they left the carcasses on the land for scavengers. And the only thing they sold were the skins and the tongues that were pickled in barrels and sent to the East Coast. That was what I would call a low-value, high-volume trade. And if you have a low-volume, high-volume trade, disaster for wildlife and disaster for the environment and disaster for the people who depend on the resources. What you need is a high-value, low-volume trade. But the tricky thing about that is when something is really valuable, like ivory, there's a huge temptation for leakage. You could try and have, South Africa has always been trying to have legalized trade in ivory, which South Africa could manage, which South Africa could regulate. But Angola could not. So the great thing, high value, low volume trade is great for a community, but it really, really risks leakage unless there's a regional or global way to manage the market. The last thing that WCS field staff have figured out, and is also kind of surprising, is you really need government law enforcement. Can anyone in the room, are you allowed to arrest people? Are you? No, you're not. A citizen's arrest. Well, a citizen's arrest is a misnomer. It's a citizen's detention. You're allowed, if you break into my house, I can grab you and hold on to you, but I have to call the cops to come and arrest you. And this is a really important thing to remember about community conservation, indigenous people's rights, indigenous conservation. Indigenous peoples, local communities, we need the timely and effective support of an arresting authority in order to enforce the law. Every tribe in North America, the Blackfeet, they can arrest their own citizens and prosecute them. But if a non-Blackfeet goes into Blackfeet territory and does something illegal, they have to call the cops from outside because they have no jurisdiction to arrest and prosecute non-Blackfeet villains. So this is a really strange thing, and we often get accused of supporting bad practice law enforcement, but without the timely and effective support of a legal authority that's able to arrest and prosecute people, no other kind, community conservation will not work. So WCS, with all of this learning, we've now formally adopted a rights-based approach to conservation, which basically means that everything we do has to comply with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Today, WCS is fundraising for and supporting the efforts of 205 Indigenous peoples around the world to meet their objectives, not to meet our objectives. The cool thing is, if they meet their objectives, honestly, WCS mission is to save wildlife in wild places. The Ojibwe in northern northern Canada are wanting, just like us, to save wildlife in wild places. They just don't call it that. Their missions and our missions are really, really aligned. But in order for WCS to demonstrate and to be held accountable for a rights-based approach, we need social safeguards. We do a lot on ethics training for government staff. Remember I told you that it was important to have government law enforcement involved? We believe that they should be able to, that they should know what their obligations as a duty bearer is, and what a rights, what a human rights, what human rights they need to uphold and respect. All of you in academia have an institutional review board, don't you? If you're trying to apply for research, WCS is the only NGO that has an IRB registered with the federal government, because we care about being accountable to the people that we work with. And almost all conservation requires some kind of, we hope, never any physical displacement. We don't want to move people off the land. But most conservation involves some kind of economic displacement. That if natural resources are being depleted by a group of, by humans, in order to prevent that depletion, something has to change. And WCS is very clear on what our policies and practices are to make sure that the least able to pay for the cost of conservation, that they don't pay for it. They don't shoulder the burden of the cost of conservation. Of course, every community that we work with, and this was true with our researchers as well, everyone is there with government consent and with community consent. And now we have a more formal approach to free, prior, and informed consent, which is making sure that everybody we work with actually understands why we're wanting to collaborate with them and partner with them, and they provide consent. Gender issues are really important. And I'm going to finish with grievance redress mechanisms. Now, most people think that a grievance redress mechanism is a way for an NGO like ourselves to ensure that we don't do anything that results in a human rights infringement, a human rights abuse. We think that's a far too narrow definition of grievance. We think that grievance redress is an incredibly cool way for trust building, because people we engage with often are marginalized and politically marginalized, economically marginalized, and having a marginalized community come to what appears to be a very powerful international organization and complaining about stuff is really challenging. And so we think that a good grievance redress is a marvelous way of building trust with the community, allowing the community an enabling mechanism to talk with us. But a grievance redress has to be accessible to everybody. It has to be transparent. The community has to know what the grievance redress mechanism is all about. Grievance redress has to be timely and fair. It has to be secure, that if you are going to complain about your village chief, you have to believe that you are not going to be the subject of some retribution by the chief. So it has to be secure. It has to be perceived as being legitimate. But most importantly, we found out it has to deal with all kinds of grievances, not just a government official raped my daughter, human rights abuse. No, it has to be David's vehicle as it drove through the village killed a village chicken. That's a grievance. A grievance could also be, why did your truck not take my son-in-law to town because you were going to town? That's a legitimate grievance. So we've learned that if you deal with all grievances, particularly the little ones, if you deal with the, why didn't you take my son-in-law or brother to town, communities begin to trust the grievance mechanism as being effective, and will then say about the really bad grievances, about that somebody got beat up by a national park guard or someone. So we've learned that addressing all grievances is vital. And we've also realized that you can't expect biologists, you can't expect managers, you can't expect general staff to run a grievance system. You actually have to hire trained grievance managers. And in every WCS field program that we have now, we have trained grievance managers. It also has to come from the community. That there's two parts of a grievance process. One is, how does the community want the grievances to be addressed? They have to decide that. It's them that has to decide how that grievance system is going to work. And that takes time to do that. So in Northeastern Ituri, the community wanted multiple channels for grievance. A lockbox where you could put they wanted a lockbox, they wanted to be able to talk to people, they wanted to be able to send SMSs, they wanted to be able to send emails, they wanted to send letters. They wanted lots of channels because different people in the community had different capacity to engage in a grievance mechanism. We were cool with that. So community-led is really important. They have to lead the process. When we talked about different types of grievances, we have the scale of severity from up at the top, positive feedback. That's kind of the things that some people actually send us. That was great. WCS and the National Park Service are doing a super job. Or really, really nasty shit at the bottom. And depending on what the grievance is, depends on what WCS and our government partners do, who needs to actually try and redress that process. And then we have a whole bunch of categories, which is just useful for our donors. The second big part of a grievance is actually tracking the grievance system. And I have to tell you this really weird thing. IUCN is a huge international conservation organization. And I was talking to one of their staff about grievance redress and said, oh, this is great. We have a toll-free number in Gland, Switzerland for our grievance. Wait a minute. Does everyone have access to cell phone? Can everyone actually afford to call Switzerland? And how, in fact, do you redress a grievance where the grievance occurred in Chile and it's recorded in Gland? The most important thing, all of us duty bearers have to figure out a way that we can actually monitor, record, and track grievances and redress them as rapidly and as fairly as possible. So we developed this system where this is the set of submissions, different ways that the different channels you can submit a grievance. Our grievance manager then enters that on a handheld device or a laptop using a tool called Kobo Toolbox, which is actually a Google tool called ODK, but remarkably, Brigham and Women's Hospital modified it to make it really user-friendly for their physicians in the field to be able to record online and offline forms. It's free. So once the data gets, let's say the data is in Gabon, and our grievance manager enters it onto his handheld. As soon as he enters either a cell network or Wi-Fi, the data gets uploaded to a server in Boston. So every 20 minutes, Open Function, another tool, checks for new records in that database, and then enters it into this piece of software called Asana, which is a multi-user task manager, basically. But it's programmable. And I programmed it to be able to be used as a grievance redress management system. So you need these two things. You need communities deciding how they want the grievance to happen, and then you need the duty bearer to figure out how to track all the grievances. And this one system works for WCS at a single site, at a national level, across the whole of Africa, or in fact, across all the places that we work. This one tracking system works for everywhere. And it allows us, stop blacking the microphone. It allows us to keep track of every grievance from someone ran over my chicken to a human rights abuse. I'm done.
Thank you so much. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
Thank you so much for this talk. I think what you guys are doing is really great. I was also wondering in what like areas, I guess, you think the WCS needs to work on or improve when it comes to human rights and these concerns.
Great point. We need to make sure that we do a good job of training our staff as to what their obligations and their responsibilities are to uphold communities' rights. We're one actor in a space. And at the moment, we're working really hard to make sure that all of our government partners, we hold ourselves accountable to. So we're working very hard to not only train our government partners so that they know what their obligations are as a duty bearer, but to encourage them to be participants in a grievance redress mechanism like the one we set up, so they're also accountable. Because a lot of governments have policies that they never implement. Governments have staff who are not trained. Governments have staff who are trained, but then don't do anything. And so our biggest push at the moment is trying to encourage, coerce, whatever way we can to raise the level of government rights management to what we currently are as an NGO. I'll tell you, in some places that's wishful thinking. In many places, it's great, and the government loves it, and the government wants our support. In other places, heck no. So, to be honest.
I have a follow-up question to that because I've often wondered, I've heard government officials say, well, I'm going to get paid if I do nothing. I'm going to get paid if I do something. So it's a lot easier to do nothing. And so I've often wondered, those of us in this room, some of us could get extra money by taking on a second job, or we could get summer salary. Is there any system that you've seen in a government situation where by actively doing, you can get supplemental pay so that would encourage saying, your base salary is set at the government level, but you can do more by working with WCS to really make a difference?
Another great question. And yes, historically, we provided services to government in national parks with no formal relationship other than a memorandum of understanding. Today, we don't do that. We do what's called a public-private partnership, which is a legal document that says the government and us are equally responsible, we have equal authority, and we have equal responsibility. And that allows us, when we have a public-private partnership, to do incentive payments, or performance payments. So if we were just had an MOU, we would have no ability to actually supplement the salary of a government official. That would be illegal. But in a public-private partnership, that we can do. So we can supplement government staff salaries based on performance. So yeah, absolutely. I think that helps us ensure that staff are well paid for what they do, because most government officials in the developing world do not get well paid. But it also means they get paid for stuff that they're actually doing rather than sitting in their office. I think you had a question. Oh. So, are we done?
Well, I just wanted to say, Daphne Hope Cunningham said, David, thank you for making us aware of your amazing, amazing on-point work with WCS, and then also thanked us and was hoping that there would be a recording. So anyway, thank you from Daphne Hope Cunningham for your presentation.
Oh my gosh, that's marvelous. Thank you very much.
So we can take one last question, and then I will encourage all of you to, if you want to stick around and for a few minutes to ask him questions, you can. And so here you go.
Yeah, I was wondering with the grievance redresses, like if there's so many like small grievances as well, do you know how many are actually able to be addressed? Like I know the database like is able to determine how many are, but like yeah, if you just kind of know like whether or not all of the grievances are addressed, it just feels like it would be like an insane amount of grievances to address.
So that was why the concern about insane amount of grievances was why our Office of General Counsel, which is our lawyers at WCS, were terrified about us actually rolling out a serious grievance mechanism. They thought, inundated by bonkers stuff. So in 10 villages in northeastern Congo between January, let me get this right, no, August 2023 and now, we received 435 grievances. 2% of those were human rights grievances. All the rest were, well, 40% were requests for information, tell us more, or suggestions. A bunch were the you ran over my chicken problem. And just, I think out of that 400, it was something like 3 were human rights grievances. And 2 of those up to date have been resolved. Resolved means to the satisfaction of the person that submitted the grievance. It doesn't mean resolved is a negotiated settlement, to be honest. The other stuff, the 400, turns out to be amazingly valuable to WCS and the community, because the community goes, I didn't even believe these guys would do that. They reimbursed me for the chicken, or we figured out a way in which people can get rides on WCS or government vehicles when they're going into town in a lottery. Or, I mean, it turned out that, yes, we got a lot of submissions. The super majority of them were easily solved. And in solving them, the good relationships, the trust building with communities was way more valuable than we could ever have imagined. And so, yes, we get a lot of submissions. Most of them are solvable by coming up and saying, so can we just reimburse you for the chicken? And it's really quick. And others, like the human rights one, did involve our lawyers, did involve our director in Kinshasa and the government getting involved to make sure that we did the right thing. But thankfully, the human rights abuses are a tiny proportion of what people are actually concerned about. So we're very happy. Thanks.